My name is Dr. Joanne Wolfe, and I serve as the immediate past president of the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine. It is my distinct pleasure to host a discussion today with Susan Cain, author of two popular books, Quiet Power, The Secret Strengths of Introverts, and Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. This one has been translated into 40 languages and remains on the New York Times bestseller list for 7 years. Susan's writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal, and other publications, and her TED Talk is famous for being one of Bill Gates' all-time favorites, being viewed more than 30 million times. Drawing on her original research and the latest in neuroscience and psychology, Susan will share with us how to better engage with those who are more introverted than ourselves, including our coworkers, those we mentor, and the patients and families we encounter in our everyday work. So welcome, Susan. It's such a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much. It is such an honor for me to be here, and I cannot thank you enough for the work that you do, all of you. So as soon as you reached out to me, I just knew that I wanted to have a way of connecting with you. And gosh, I wasn't planning to say this, but I guess I just will. My brother actually fell ill with COVID last week and had a massive COVID-caused stroke and passed away a couple days ago with the help of a palliative care team. So thank you for what you do.
Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. Wow.
Sorry, I didn't mean to start off that way, but
It's okay. I honestly can't imagine what you're going through, and even appreciate more your willingness to do this interview with us right now. So,
oh yeah, of course.
Getting back to the topic of the interview, it would help us all to understand why you first began doing research in the area of introversion, and why did you think there needed to be a book that would be on the shelves to address this issue?
Yeah, I mean, so that's one of those questions I could probably, spend an hour answering because there's so many different things to say. But I have been thinking about this subject, I think, all my life, from the time I was 4 years old, probably, although, of course, I didn't back then know the word introvert or extrovert. But I had always been aware of having a preference for quiet and for reflection and for playing with my friends in a one-on-one kind of way, and for not liking it so much when things got into a big noisy group. And all of this I was aware of. But I started to see it kind of as a social dynamic as I got older, and as a cultural dynamic. I actually, I had this long detour into the world of being a corporate lawyer before I ever became a writer. And while I was a lawyer, I was sort of looking around and observing. I was really interested in questions of gender and things like that, and how they shaped the way we would show up at work and the different ways that we would act and interact. But I started to think that there was this other force that was going on. That I'd sit in these big like boardroom tables of people negotiating some deal or something. And that gender didn't really explain all the differences in the way people were behaving in those situations. Mm-hmm. And I thought that what was really happening was this fundamental difference in personality style, and there was no way of talking about that at the time. And I started to realize that this was like a big cultural force that was certainly affecting my own life, but was really affecting the lives of people around me, and showing up in the way that we work, and the way we teach our kids at school, and the way we parent them, and the way we interact with each other, and the way we solve conflicts, and the way we interact with patients. Like an introverted patient versus an extroverted patient are going to have really different needs of what they're looking for. And as providers, I think you also have different needs in what you need, especially with the work that you all are doing, where I imagine you have to be quite mindful to make sure that you don't burn out emotionally and physically. So to know whether you're more introverted or more extroverted is going to have a huge impact on how you meet those needs so you can stay in your equilibrium. And we can talk more about those specifics if you would like.
Sure. You mentioned something that I just want to ask about briefly, which is that you said that perhaps these personality types go beyond gender to explain differences. Do you think that there are gender tendencies in terms of extroversion and introversion, since you sort of noted it in yourself, and maybe first describe those differences to gender?
Well, I mean, in terms of statistics, the statistics show that it's about 50% of men are introverted, 50% of women. So you don't really see the differences in that way. But what you see is that it plays out really differently with different sets of challenges and strengths. So, like for, let's say, an introverted woman, there are certain ways in which it's easier because being quiet conforms more to the age-old stereotype of, of the quiet woman. It can even be seen as mysterious, or it could just be seen as part of what femininity is. For better or for worse, it can be seen that way. But then on the other hand, it's very easy, especially in a workplace setting, to be quickly written off as being too quiet, not assertive enough, not having enough presence. And if you're female, those negative attributes can attach to you that much more easily because you don't have the authority that might automatically be granted to someone who is male. Now, men, on the other hand, who are introverted, have a different set of challenges. They have that sort of automatic authority, but on the other hand, there's such a cultural expectation for men to be very assertive and dominant, and the alpha guy of the movies. And if you don't, as a guy, if you feel like you're not living up to that role, that can be a source of a lot of pain until you figure out a way to make sense of it and really like inhabit your own power. And there are ways to inhabit your own power and also be yourself and draw on your own strengths. But for some men, it can take a while to get there and figure out what that's going to look like.
So I guess what it comes down to a lot is, especially if you're in a position of leadership, understanding how to sort of leverage your introversion, perhaps if that's what you tend towards, to be an effective leader. And it's not often associated, sort of leadership and quiet, and yet you have uncovered numerous examples of very powerful quiet leadership. What does quiet leadership mean to you, and why should we be nurturing quiet leaders in our schools and workplaces?
Well, I mean, even if you start with data, we know that we should be nurturing them because there's a lot of data showing that quiet/introverted leaders deliver outcomes that are as good, or in some cases better, than extroverted leaders in the same circumstance. So, and we also know from the data that introverts tend to get passed over for leadership positions. So what that's adding up to is a big deficit in talent. Like that, there's all this talent that's just sitting there that's not getting groomed. People who could be sharing their talents and sharing them in ways that are sort of differently inspiring from what is usually on tap. So, what does introverted leadership look like? It's many different things. It can be leading by example. And I'll just tell you, because this is the day of talking about my brother, I just literally like 15 minutes before getting on this call, on this Zoom call, my brother's wife sent to me a kind of tribute that he had been a radiologist at Mount Sinai in New York City. And they sent a tribute that his colleagues had written for him, and and he was an introvert, and they talked a lot about, and he had been, I didn't even know this because he hadn't told me, which is so characteristic, right? But he had been voted like outstanding lecturer of the year and teacher of the year and all this different stuff. I had no idea. And you know, and they talked about him leading by example and doing things like you know, never letting a case go until he could make sure that they were really getting the appropriate diagnosis, and sometimes dragging the ultrasound machine up to the patient's room in the middle of the night to make sure that they were getting an accurate reading and things like that. And you know, people see that that's a form of leadership too. So we don't always, when we imagine, you know, the textbook swaggering leader again from the movies, there's a lot more to leadership than that. And I'll give you another example. A guy named Douglas Conant, who was until recently the CEO of Campbell Soup. He's a very shy and introverted guy, really lovely person. When he took over at Campbell, Campbell was at the bottom of the Fortune of employee engagement for the Fortune 500. Mm-hmm. And by the time he stepped down 10 years later, it was at the top. And he was not the guy who was out there schmoozing with employees, but he used to find out who were the employees who had really been contributing. And he would sit down and write to them these heartfelt letters of thanks and gratitude. And during his time at Campbell, he wrote 30,000 of those letters, which, you know, like that's a crazy amount of letters. And an extroverted leader would find a different way of connecting with employees. And this is the way that he found. And I think that we often fall into a trap of assuming that, you know, this, like a physician in this field has this personality, and, you know, somebody who's in a sales field has that personality, and somebody who's a leader has this other personality. And that's a really cramped and limited way to look at it. And so I think instead, if we kind of start from the place of thinking, what am I truly passionate about doing, step one, and then step two is, how am I going to make my own way of being work for this passion? That's going to get us where we need to be.
Well, it sounds like both men, your brother and the CEO, were really impactful leaders in their own sort of gentle way. And I'm curious, you know, palliative care and hospice is often based on teamwork.
Yeah.
And a lot of respect for and working together across professions and disciplines. And I'm curious how to effectively lead teams from the, you know, if you're one of those introverted leaders, or in general, what your thoughts are about teamwork in the context of this discussion.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I will say almost every palliative care provider who I have ever interacted with, kind of in a one-on-one way, has told me that they're introverted. Because, you know, I'm like the world's great confessor for all introverts. So whenever people meet me, they start telling me who they are. So you know, I've never taken a survey in your field, but I am guessing if you send one out in conjunction with this talk, I'm going to predict it's like 90%. Could be wrong. But I'd be curious if you end up doing that to hear the results. And if we were meeting in person right now, I would be asking you all to raise your hands. So I'm sorry we can't do that. But the fact of being introverted doesn't mean that you can't work really collaboratively and effectively on a team. And again, how do you do that? It starts by having a real straight up talk with yourself and figuring out, how do you do these things best? So for some people, for some introverts in particular, they love to work with people one-on-one. And that's where they really connect. Mm-hmm. So if you know that's you and you've got a team of people, you need to make sure that you are scheduling enough one-on-one time with them so that you can build the bonds that you need in the quiet way that you need to make them happen. And you can lead from that place. And yeah, I think that we often assume introversion means a lack of social skills, and it's not necessarily that at all. It's more a question of, where do you draw your energy? So if you are an introvert, A, managing a team, and B, in a profession that is draining for anyone, you need to really make sure that you're building in enough recharge time, so that you're not getting overwhelmed and feeling drained. And what I always say to people is, like, take a look at your schedule in a day by day by day way. And if you know, let's say, that you're going to have a day that's filled up with activities that you find draining and exhausting, whatever they are, make sure to schedule in time where you get to be by yourself or taking a walk or whatever it is that you find restorative, and schedule those items into your calendar also. And you have to stick to those commitments just as fiercely as you would a commitment to a patient or to a colleague, because it matters just as much, not only because of your duty to your own self, but if that's uncomfortable for you, you'll be much better with your patients and your colleagues if you give yourself that time that you need.
I
So,
love that. That's basically what you mean by the concept of restorative niches, and just why they're so important. I think they're important for everyone,
yeah.
especially in fields such as ours, where whether or not you're an introvert or extrovert, there's a lot of need to be self-aware,
Yes.
and to in the context of that, figure out restorative practices, and that's essential for longevity in our field.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I just want to say that the concept and the term of restorative niches comes from the work of this amazing personality psychologist named Brian Little.
Mm.
And he talks about the importance in life of kind of figuring out what your core personal projects are. And then he says, by which he means, like, what is the work that really matters to you? Who are the people in your life who matter the most? What are the commitments and causes that matter the most? And in the service of those core projects, for the love of those, you will step outside your comfort zone and do things that are draining for you or scary for you. But you're not going to just do them for anything. You're going to do them when it matters. And then you're going to make sure you find your restorative niche afterwards, as you were just saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that introverts and extroverts make decisions differently?
There are tendencies in which they do. Um, so for one thing, we know that, okay, you know how, all of you, that we have in our brains the dopamine driven reward networks, right? So one of the interesting findings about introverts and extroverts is that the reward networks for extroverts tend to be more easily activated and kind of stay activated more easily than those of an introvert, which means in real life that when there is the prospect of something rewarding, whether it's a career reward or is getting to talk to someone you want or whatever it is, an extrovert is going to feel that much more kind of engaged to make that thing happen. And as with all things, there's that's good, and it's for better and for worse, as with all traits. So the for better side of that is it can make, when you're faced with making a decision, let's say, if you see the reward over there and your body is activating to the reward, you're more likely to make the decision that's going to make you go for it. It's kind of like a perfect, it's like seize the day. There's a perfect synchronicity between that expression and this biochemistry. For an introvert, because they're that much less activated, they're more likely to be saying, well, what about this? What about that? Let me consider this. Let me consider that. And there have been a number of studies that have tracked these differences. And I think it's important for people to understand this about themselves. Like, if you're the person who is overly influenced by the presence of the shiny object in your decision making, it can be really helpful to have someone with you who's not, and vice versa.
Yeah, it sounds like we think a lot in the academy and in our field about building a diverse team.
Yeah.
and one that complements each other's strengths, let's just say.
Yep.
And this feels like another diversity characteristic that's really important to building an effective team, I
I
guess.
agree with that. I think it's so important. And I will tell you, in businesses, I'm starting to see more and more companies include temperament and personality, introversion, extroversion as kind of a central part of their diversity thinking.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
So I know you're a mother,
Yep.
and so am I. And I wonder, sort of, we think about caring for younger people and kids and nurturing them. If there's anything in particular that you think is helpful for those of us who are raising introverts, based on your experience.
Yeah, there's so much to know about this. So I want to say, because as much as I say now, it's not going to be enough for those of you who might be raising children who are shy or introverted or both. Um, so I think it's the last chapter in my book is specifically about kids, and there's also stuff on my website, which is quietrev.com. Everything there is free, um, about this. So just so you know, one of the things I always say about introverted kids is that they tend to have a longer runway that they travel down before they take off and fly. But they will fly. It's just they need more time on the runway. And they need to know from you as their parent that you're with them on the runway, that you think it's cool that they're on the runway, that you're strategizing with them while they're on the runway of what it's going to be like when they're up in the sky. That's a nice extended metaphor, but I'll bring it down to reality for you. Um, Many introverted children or shy children are apprehensive about learning to swim. So the answer is not to respond with great overprotectiveness and say, you don't have to learn how. But the answer is also not to throw them in the water, throw them in the deep end, which is kind of the classic American thinking. Um, the answer instead is to let them know they've got to do it, but be with them along the way and expose them to the water at a slow and gentle pace, and reward them each step of the way. So, maybe you go to the swimming pool on an afternoon when you know it's going to be quiet and they're going to be one of the only ones there. And maybe they dip their toe in the water and you celebrate wildly, and then you go home. Good. And then you come back again and do it little by little. And eventually you're not going to be able to tell that kid apart from the one who is just happily swimming all along. But your child needs to know that you're with them in that process and that you understand what they're experiencing. And it's very easy for these kids to feel inadvertently shamed if they're going more slowly than other kids. And so you want to make sure that you're not contributing to that message yourself. And part of the work of that is acknowledging that it can be more difficult as a parent when that's happening. Partly just because you would like to be reading your magazine on the deck chair and not having a whole elaborate thing to have your child go in the water. And partly because maybe your friends' kids are already swimming and yours isn't, and that can feel really uncomfortable. And those feelings are okay, but you first need to acknowledge that they're happening and that they're all right.
Yeah. Makes me wonder if it makes a difference if you're an introverted or extroverted parent, in the sense of how you relate to your child and how you might interpret their more tentative approach, and that probably makes a big difference.
It really does make a difference. And it's not, as with everything, there are pros and cons to both ways of being. If you're the introverted parent, of course you're going to understand more what your child's experiencing. It won't be baffling to you, but it can sometimes make it, unless you've kind of done your own work of coming to terms with whatever difficulties you might have had as an introverted child and so on, it can make it more difficult for you to respond, because you might end up reliving old painful memories or like that. So you might have some of your own work to do so that you can be most helpful for your child. And in fact, I often hear from introverted parents who will tell me they think they're overdoing it with pushing their kids out there because they don't want them to experience social difficulties. So they end up pushing too hard, and it can be harder to get the balance right when you're feeling kind of when the situation is fraught for you. Now, extroverted parents, on the other hand, have the challenge of feeling completely baffled by why their child would prefer to, let's say, chill out after school instead of going and playing with their friends. Like, why on earth would you ever have that preference? There must be something wrong, surely. And so, for a parent like that, just to read a book or watch a talk or whatever it is that's going to help you understand what life looks like from your child's point of view will probably change your outlook enormously. And know that once you understand your child, you can be an amazing parent for them because they can kind of learn how to draw a little bit on your way of being. Even if it's not theirs, they're going to kind of pick things up from you that are going to help them. So there's no one way to do it.
It makes me think too, in our profession and across professions, we're always trying to mentor early career folks.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you have any advice for us in terms of mentoring people earlier in their career as to become leaders based on sort of their different personality types.
Well, I would say with anybody who you're mentoring who's early on, I would sit down and ask them to tell you where they would want to be in 1 year, 3 years, 5 or 10 years, where they'd want to be in their careers if they had no fear and if they had no other stumbling blocks standing in their way. So what's the dream big version of where they'd want to be? And for the quieter people, we often tend to assume that someone who's quieter is less ambitious, when in fact there's no such correlation. So you want to really encourage them to, give you that version. And then you want to, once you hear what the dream is, you want to strategize together. Well, how can I help you get there? And what are the steps you need to take? And it's usually, if we're talking about somebody who's on the quiet side, but might want to become a leader, it's usually a combination of, number one, learning how to draw on the strengths that they already have, which they might not be thinking of those strengths as associated with leadership, even if they really are. But number two, to help kind of nudge them out of their comfort zones little by little. So maybe next time you're going to be at some kind of an all hands meeting together, you might say to that person, hey, can you handle, the XYZ part of the agenda? And maybe it's just a 2-minute part of the agenda, but you put them in charge for those 2 minutes. And you hopefully choose an area where they already have a lot of expertise and confidence and authority, so that you're building with a level of confidence and success each time.
Nice. So you've been thinking about this topic of introversion for a long time. Your book was published in 2012. Do you think that we've seen a change culturally in terms of increasing awareness, acceptance, dialogue about the power of introverts? Or do we have a long way to go?
Well, it's a little bit of both. And I'm going to give you the analogy of feminism, where, we have made enormous strides in the last, years, decades, century, whatever you want to look at. And there's still a long way to go. And so analogously, I think it's like that here. There's still a long way to go. And I also see an incredibly different landscape from how it was when my book first came out in 2012. And I see this in all kinds of anecdotal ways. So first of all, so many companies and schools now have this kind of at the forefront of their thinking. Whether they're getting it right or not is almost a different question. Like they actually know it matters, and they're trying to work on it. And then you see it in these other ways. Like a friend of mine is a professor at Harvard Business School, and she would start her classes she would do leadership classes, and she would start them with a personality test, where one of the components was to figure out how introverted or extroverted you are. And she says it used to be that no one would admit to being an introvert. So like year after year, she would have a class of apparently 100% extroverts. And in the last few years, that has stopped happening. And now, people don't really think about it. It's like half are introverts and half are extroverts, and that's how it is.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Here. We're coming to the end of our time together. I'm wondering if you can offer any final remarks as we close the session.
I guess I don't know that the following thing is a grand concluding statement, but there's a theme that I noticed that we kept coming back to with all these different topics that we've been exploring. And it's the theme of how do you overcome anything that's difficult for you, particularly something that's difficult in the sense of a fear, something you might feel afraid of, or just like discomfort that's shaded with fear. And we know from the psychological research that there's a time-honored way to do this that really works, and I've experienced it. And the way is to expose yourself to the thing that you are afraid of in really small and manageable doses. And I'll just quickly tell you my story of this, which is that I used to be completely flat out terrified of public speaking, to the point that when I was a lawyer, like anytime I had to give any kind of talk, I would reliably lose 5 pounds before, because I couldn't eat for a week beforehand. And when my book was coming out, Quiet, I knew that I didn't want that fear to stand in my way, and I thought I would try to get over it. And so I actually, it was kind of like drawing on the work of Brian Little with the Core Personal Projects. It was like that book and that project mattered so much to me that was the time to really get outside my comfort zone. So I signed up for a class in public for people with public speaking anxiety, where on the first day of the class, all you had to do was sit down. Oh, no, I'm sorry, you had to stand up, say your name, sit back down, and declare victory, and you were done. And then you'd go back the next week and it would be ratcheted up a little bit, like maybe you'd stand up and answer a few questions about where you grew up and where'd you go to school, and then you were finished. And each week it was a little harder, a little harder. And that's really and you do that enough times and you're basically training your amygdala that the thing that it thinks is so horrifying that it should get you the heck away from that thing. It's basically training your amygdala that this thing does not have the negative consequences that you thought it did. And the only way to train it that way is by having positive experiences. And the only way to do that is to take it really step by step. So for anybody who's listening, like whatever your fear is, if it's public speaking, and I'm sure that's a lot of you because it's half the population, you should definitely sign up for Toastmasters as soon as physical distancing is over. But really this applies for any fear, whether it's your child's fear or your own or any other kind of discomfort. It's like little by little is a magic, miraculous way of being.
Wonderful. Actually resonates also in our work, that we try to gently help seriously ill patients and their families face their greatest fears as well.
Yeah.
So what you said is very powerful. And I just want to say,
oh, I'm sorry, can I say one other thing? Because I just realized we didn't really talk about how you might want to interact differently with patients depending on whether you think they're more introverted or extroverted. And I mean, I don't want to completely generalize because of course it's person by person, but an introverted patient, well, first of all, they might enjoy the kind of more someone who's extroverted and can kind of keep the conversation going easily for them. They also tend to want to go, deep and talk about real subjects and not so much enjoy the more like schmoozing, lighthearted banter. They might want to like go directly to whatever is the topic at hand. Whereas an extroverted patient might just more enjoy just the sheer stimulation of interaction will be of interest and comforting.
That's very helpful.
Yeah.
And in general, this has been a wonderful opportunity just to learn from you and all the work that you've put into helping us better understand the introvert. And I appreciate your time and insights and wisdom, and I think so will our hospice and palliative care community. I also just want to say that my heart goes out to you and your family about the loss of your brother. And just conclude by saying, on behalf of the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine and the Hospice and Palliative Nurses Association, that we're truly, truly grateful for your time. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I want to thank all of you for the work that you do in the world. And I'm so thrilled. My perception as a layperson outside of the medical field is that your field is gaining more and more centrality and recognition and playing an ever increasing role in the lives of patients. And that absolutely thrills me. I'm so glad that this is happening. And I'm so grateful for the work that you do. And my next book, by the way, is all about kind of joy and sorrow and longing and how do you live joyfully in a world that contains sorrow and all these questions. So I think it's kind of right up the alley of where you all work. So
well, good. We'll have you back again then.
Oh, I would love that. And in the meantime, I should tell you, I have a my website is quietrev.com, but I have a newsletter and social media, so you can sign up for the newsletter. It's all free and everything, and you'll be able to follow with new updates. So
wonderful. Thank you so much, Susan. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.